Fun enough, it's amusing that you asked me earlier about how I got into playing keyboards because
Yeah.
at some point one of the fans online said something about there's no keyboard credits on this album. He says there are no keyboards on this album, and I didn't really think to credit myself because I credit myself with producing it, and so obviously the keyboards are just part of the production, and so they're not intended to be a feature. It's just the whole thing. There's a difference, I think, between like the guitar and the drums being played, those particular instruments, and just the sounds and different effects and things you do to create the whole production. And
Yeah.
then we wanted to tie it all together. We were very much into the landscape idea. I mean, it's not a concept album in the sense of we didn't come up with one story and the whole album is about this one story, but it is a bit like the concept albums. Like you said, maybe that's kind of one of the prog aspects
Hmm.
that most of the songs run into one another so that you don't kind of stop and start, okay, that song's over. Rather, we're moving, okay, to a different stage of the journey right now.
I must
And
say, I think it flows very well from the first track to the last. Certainly has a good flow to it. Um,
well,
it could have been if you had them in a different order. I think it might have been a bit strange, but I think it's a good decision to have them the way they are at the moment.
yeah, that's important
Yeah,
to us. And in a way, we want to respect the listener. You know,
yeah,
they've been waiting 40 years for this thing, so
yeah.
let's do everything just the best that it can possibly be, the best that we can possibly do.
Mm,
And so part of that is treating an album in a sense with reverence, like when we were kids. Like this is
mm,
something important. This isn't just throwaway. I feel that probably if we had continued through the years and we kept making albums all the time and touring and doing all the band things, this album could not have been this good because it would have been production line. You know, okay, another album comes along. This one, more first of all, the fact that nobody expected it,
mm,
including us, that's kind of good. So it gave us the freedom to do whatever we wanted.
yeah.
Uh, we didn't, in a sense, have a reputation to upkeep because our reputation has gone long ago. Um, but also, um, in a way, I think when bands come back, and people have told me this, you know, people have been interviewing me, said usually when bands come back, they're either trying to recapture what they had before, or they're just, you know, they're not quite as good. I mean, people have said to me, well, we didn't have very high expectations for your new album, but now we hear it, we're surprised because in a way, we're not so much trying to recapture what we did before. We feel we didn't fulfill ourselves with what we did before. So now is the time when we're trying to realize what we always wanted to do.
Mm. I was listening to a lot of your earlier stuff quite recently to try and familiarize myself with what you were doing because I never really listened to your material around the time that I was
I
touring
don't
and
blame you. Don't blame me at all.
not because I didn't like it. It didn't really. It wasn't. I dived deep into the progressive rock era and kind of stayed there for
Mind
quite.
you, at that time, there was not that much progressive rock. I mean, Meridian, when they came along, they were kind of like the first of a new wave of that, weren't they?
Yeah, but I mean, I was deep into Genesis at the time,
Are you
and
still listening to the old stuff?
yeah, but I was studying Tony Banks's style and learning
Okay.
Rick Wakeman and stuff like this. So it was that's where I came from musically, and then I diversified quite rapidly throughout the 80s. Obviously, joining the Flock of
What a
Seagulls.
gent. Rick Wakeman, what a gent. I interviewed him once for one of my
Oh,
radio.
really?
We had such fun. I love him.
Well, I toured with Damien Wilson, who was his lead singer for several years. And he dropped me right into it back in 2009. He phoned me up and he said, Damien phoned me up and said, Chris, I'm going to be doing a tour. And our keyboard players just pulled out. And seeing as you're familiar with Rick's album, The Myths and Legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, do you fancy giving it a go? I said, how long have I got? And he said, you got 2 weeks to let me know. You got 2 days to let me know, and then we start rehearsing in 2 weeks. We had 3 rehearsals, and I knew the album, I knew a lot of those tracks, a lot of the solos on the organs, all that stuff. So I managed to wing it, but like 27 prog rock tracks, which are just all over the place. And I thought, oh my God, I'll go for it. But it was tough. It was tough, but it was.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the King Arthur thing. I don't know if you know the story, but Rick Wakeman told me that
He was in hospital, wasn't he?
Well, he didn't mention that, but he told me that so he had this album and he wanted to do it in Wembley, and they said to him, "Well, we've got an ice show that week." So he said,
Yes.
we'll do it on ice then.
Yeah. And he bankrolled it as well, didn't he?
That was so funny, so casual, you know, these great moments in rock and roll history you always heard about. And when you start to kind of hear the backstory and realize kind of fickle, because another thing, at the time when I interviewed him, he had a book out called Say Yes, and he's got such funny stories in there. One of them was about how he ended up sleeping in his car, you know, at some point, and you would never imagine that, you know, big superstar, you think. And then there was another much older story, earlier story that I loved, where he said he used to, as a teenager, I guess, be in a band where they went and they played at some particular hall in Neaton or something every Saturday night. He said that back in those days, there was no electric piano, so the piano was always the other side of the hall to where the stage was. It was usually propped up by books or bricks or something. And he said their audience every Saturday night was a bunch of Down syndrome kids. So they played their songs, and the kids would whoop and holler and dance to their music. They felt really good. Then they got a better gig. So one time he went back on a Saturday night and they had the Salvation Army band, and the kids were still whooping and hollering and dancing just the same. So Rick Wakeman, he's got amazing stories. Like, he's so funny, lovely guy. Yeah,
I saw him about 3 years ago at Ronnie Scott's doing an acoustic show, and he was talking about when he was working with David Bowie and all those classic tracks. He was playing those tracks and explaining the times that they met and going through the whole history. He's got amazing.
He always says he only got paid 50 quid for each one of those.
Yeah, probably, yeah.
But no, it's interesting. You're kind of awakening in me this sort of prog rock thing that I'd almost forgotten that I had in my past, because through the 80s, it was very uncool to be into that kind of music, you know?
Yeah.
They were the dinosaurs, right?
Yeah.
Although using the word dinosaurs is funny, because before prog rock, I was into the California rock, you know, the hippie stuff. And so I used to like these hippie bands like
Mamas and Papas?
Well, there was Country Joe and the Fish was one of them. There was one called Quicksilver. I like Janis Joplin, you know, big holding company. And so Country Joe and the Fish. Have you ever seen the Woodstock movie?
I've seen some of it, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. So Country and the Fish, Country Joe and the Fish.
Watch it again. Actually, it's amazing.
Yeah, Country Joe and the Fish are in that. And the thing is, I mean, he was famous for doing a sort of F you up yours type thing before punk, long before punk. But the guitarist in his band was called The Fish. And so one time he came to England, he played at Dingwall's. So me and a friend, I don't know if we were still at school at that time, so we went over to see him at Dingwall's. We were chatting away to him, you know. And so he was one of my favorite guitarists. And another one was from this band Quicksilver Messenger Service. And so later on, they were playing together in a band called the Dinosaurs, I guess through the 80s, or I don't know if they were still going by the 90s. But what the interesting thing was no matter what era of music you're from, whether it's the 60s or the 70s, 80s, there's always an audience for it in America. Like the old bands never die. And I think one of the reasons for that is probably because they've always had so many radio stations.
Yeah.
So you could always hear in America any kind of music. One time I was this is when I was still living in London. It was probably in the Classix days, like in the 80s. So we were over to Germany for something. And on the plane, before the plane was delayed coming back. So at the gate was an older guy with a guitar, and we started chatting. And so he said to me, he'd been in Medicine Head, and now he was in Mott the Hoople. And I think, what the hoople? You know, it's kind of, we thought they died by now. He said he was going to tour in America. So bands never died. They always just came to tour in America. That was the way
Yeah.
it went.
Well, how is the music scene in America now? How would you
Well,
describe it?
well, I think it's the same in the sense that um, every era exists.
Right.
Because back in England, I don't know if it's changed now, but at our time, young people were always very kind of trend orientated. One time I drove a bus, a minibus of teenagers to the seaside, Clacton or somewhere, and I noticed in the minivan, all the music they were playing was within 6 months old. They didn't play anything that was a year old. And I know when we were going through our era, it was very much like that. We happened to be the new thing at one moment for the very early 80s.
Mm.
And after a while, you're replaced with something else. But in America, that you don't get replaced because partly they're all very much in awe. I mean, you know, you've been touring here. They're very much in awe of anybody that's really had success at something. They're respectful of. That's the first thing. I mean, not even just success. You could say anybody that has a skill that's well qualified for something, they tend to be respectful. Brits, I think, never were that respectful of anybody. So that's the first thing that's different. But there's another thing about America that most people from Britain would not really understand. It was only when I came to live here, I realized in Britain, pretty much everybody lives in cities. You know, you've got 20% of the population more or less living in London. And then when you take the other major cities, so you go to Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, Newcastle, Bristol, there's hardly anybody left. Almost nobody lives in the country in England. But in America, almost nobody lives in the cities because they're so spread out. See, every state, like the state of Michigan, apparently could fit Britain in 10 times. But there are no really famous cities in Michigan. Well, Detroit, maybe you'd say Detroit. It's not the capital of Michigan, but Detroit is the only really well-known city. I know some of the other cities because I've been there, but they don't have a lot of big cities. So they have this whole expanse with maybe every state, a big state might have maybe three, four cities in it. Some of the really big ones like Texas or California might have more, but typically like New York is just New York. There's no other famous cities really. And so as a result, because people basically live in the country or in suburbs, see, a lot of people live in farms and very small towns. I've been through towns, you see them on the American movies, they might refer to them as like one stoplight in the town, which means traffic lights.
Yeah.
That don't even permanently stop, they just flash.
Right.
There are places in Texas I've been that are like that. So there's a huge swath, whatever the correct word is, of young people in America that have never actually been to a proper live concert. And certainly not by anybody famous. This whole tribute bands is very big now. So a lot of people can go and see somebody that's trying to be Genesis or Deep Purple or whatever, but not the real thing. And so their whole experience of music, and especially live music, is usually used to be from MTV maybe, or these days it's from the internet, from YouTube. So as a result, because you can experience everything from YouTube, it doesn't matter whether it's from 1960 or 1990 or 2000. It's like, okay, well, that's cool. You know, they'll be open to things and they'll say it's cool. So I think the whole experience for young people these days is pretty much Spotify. And so everything is in Spotify. So they might search playlists. I mean, as I said, I know young people in their 20s who know some of the Classix Nouveaux music because it's on different playlists, usually 80s playlists or something like that. And so sometimes I was taken by one of my young people who's a piano player to see Paul Simon not so long ago because he discovered Simon and Garfunkel, I guess.
Right.
So we went to a big gig with Paul Simon, and who else did he tell me he's got into? I think he got in. I think he might have. He's been to Phil Collins as well, actually. So that would be the main difference, I think. The fact that heavy rock never went away in America is largely because of these small town boys, you know. It seems to resonate with people that drive tractors and things like that. When we were all busy doing funny hairstyles and putting on makeup, like they were still, come on, let's rock, you know. And that's why you had a whole lot of American rock bands throughout the whole of the 80s, 90s. Most of them were not really known in England, but they were having the big hits here in America while we were busy with whatever the latest thing was.
Back in the 90s, I used to play a lot used to play piano bar circuits in Norway, especially when it was absolutely heaving with piano bars up and down the country. And it reminds me of what you just said about America, having small little towns everywhere where people sort of listen to their whatever they want to listen to. But in Norway, you had a lot of young people who, and you'd be in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the Arctic, and they'd ask for Janis Joplin, Mercedes-Benz, and Creedence Clearwater Revival. And these would be 20-year-old kids, you know?
Yeah.
20, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. And they would keep asking for the old classics, funny enough. But that's because their parents used to listen to them, because it's quite, you know, it's still a very sparse country. It's a huge country, Norway, in terms of length, and not a very large population considering the size of the country itself. So there's lots of little villages all over the place. And the piano bar was the place where they'd meet, the pub, they meet and sit around the piano, and they'd queue up around the corner when it'd be minus 20 degrees outside to get in and have a few beers and just sing some great songs, you know, which is great. And I was lucky enough to be there at the beginning and sort of got taken by that tide of work for several years.
Yeah. Well, we know that. Yeah, we know that culture because we used to go to all the Scandinavian countries. We even went to Iceland,
right.
And so Finland was a place that we used to tour a lot. We even had a guitarist from Finland for a while, and yeah, you're right. There'd be places right in the middle of nowhere. The big things about Scandinavia, for people that haven't been there, first of all, they have 6 months essentially of winter.
Especially the higher up you go. Yeah.
So summer is very beautiful there, where it's all lakes and greenery.
Oh, stunning.
But in the winter, there's a lot of depression, suicides, and a lot of alcoholism.
Very much so.
So you reminded me of a story there in Finland one time where we're in the middle of, probably like you described, in the middle of nowhere. And this particular place, they had a very low stage. So as I'm standing singing on the stage, the people's heads are kind of, you know, up to about here on me.
Yeah.
So one drunk guy at the front of the stage starts trying to grab my mic stand. So I take the mic stand off and then just take the mic. Back in those days, they were all wired. You didn't have radio mics. So next thing, he starts pulling at my mic cable. So I'm trying to get the attention of the roadies or security guys, whoever was there, you know, so nobody was paying any attention. Eventually I just get the mic and I bang on top of his head. When they heard the banging, then they all turn around and then they decide to deal with him. That kind of thing was very indicative of those sort of places. There was another time, actually, again in Finland, where it was the opposite. We were way high up on stilts, the stage, and some guy climbs up and he hands me a sausage. So I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to do with it. So
maybe you looked hungry.
That must be it. Yeah. Oh my goodness, there's so many great stories from all these places, isn't there? Really?
Yeah, when you start talking about them, they start come flooding back, don't they? I remember I was on stage once on a gig in Norway, and you know, a friend of mine was playing, and I went to see him, and he was playing Great Balls of Fire, and he wanted me to get up and do the piano solo bit. So I wasn't actually working that night, and I had quite a few beers. So I sat on the stool, went to do it, and there was that much gap between the piano stool and the back of the stage, and I just fell off the stage. Right in the middle of the gig. I just disappeared and everyone just started laughing. And he was playing the guitar. That's what it was. He was playing the guitar. And he said, go on, you can do the solo. And I went, yeah, you shake my nerves then. My brain, went flying over. My feet in the air and everything. Hilarious.
Well, of course, you were with Gary touring with Seagulls. And we always used to have a laugh about them because when they first started opening for us at the Marquee, I think, and we used to call them the hairdressers from Liverpool. Sorry, fans. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mike, or fans, if you're watching, Seagulls fans. But I loved, in the Wedding Singer, that scene where, Adam Sandler goes up to the airline counter and the guy's got a funny hairstyle and he says to him, do you like the flock of seagulls? And Adam says, well, I can see that you do. Actually, I also enjoyed in that movie, it starts off with some guy doing Dead or Alive, You Spin Me Round.
Yeah.
And Pete Burns was one of the times when we played in Liverpool. I remember him being in the back of our van. I can't quite remember exactly why he was there or how he got there. And that was before they were famous. But he always had this kind of running fight going with Boy George about who really originated that look, because George was in London and Pete was in Liverpool, and George was the one that was really associated with more than anybody else. But there's some great people back then. There was some fascinating characters, really.
Yeah. Oh, those are the days. I mean, although memories are what you make them, aren't they? They're all around us. It's a case of what we go through as human beings, what experiences we have, what the people that we meet. Right now, we're making memories. We'll remember this interview in years to come. It'll be on the internet. But it's funny how once you start talking about those times, they just come flooding back. And I think it's really important to have those thoughts in our minds, because that's all we have left is our memories, And,
well, I've kind of got to appreciate that more with doing this particular round of interviews, because to us who were doing music in the 80s, that was just normal. That was the age we are. That was what we did. But what I'm coming to realize now is for people who were not there, people who are younger, people who were not born yet, it's history for them. We were part of music history. And so you're quite right in saying that once we're gone, then that is gone.
Yeah.
And so the only thing that remains would be these kinds of interviews on the internet. And so the people who were really there talking about how this little thing happened, or when historians look at it, they always tend to make something of it that it wasn't. They make things sound better, or they try and say, well, this was because of this and this was because of this. But at the time, when you're kids that just kind of want to play music and find a purpose in life, you're not really typically planning, okay, we're going to make this movement and it's going to be called this, and all that stuff comes later. Other people put that on top of it. But all you're doing is like, this is what I feel. I was thinking just the other day in the bathtub when I'm shaving my head, and thinking that when the Sex Pistols started, they probably didn't know it was going to be called punk. I mean, I don't know exactly why and how it started. We've all seen the movies and all that, and McLaren tries to take credit as though he had this great scheme. I don't believe he ever did. I think it all just kind of happened, and like those things do. And then afterwards, you can start trying to claim the credit and say it was something significant. But it's all just history, and easily could have gone a different way. If any of us had made a different choice and we're going to do this kind of music instead, or we're going to look a different way, if we hadn't happened to meet the right record company at the right time, it's very hit and miss, haphazard, really.
It is. And if you go back on your life and look at where you started and who you met, this door opened, that one closed, that you met that person who introduced you to this person, to that situation, to this band or whatever. It's quite fascinating how one's life pans out like a huge spider's web, and takes you down different roads and avenues, and just opens up in front of you.
Yeah, I think though over time, what I find kind of quite interesting now is that once people have had some life's experience and have a perspective, you can kind of relate on a better level. Back in the day, sometimes like when we were first starting off,
Mm.
and if we might have been opening for somebody who was a bit bigger than us because they'd had more albums already or whatever, they generally didn't even talk to us, you know.
Hmm.
But today, if we should meet up, well, it doesn't really matter, does it? How big you thought you were back then,
Yeah,
or what your latest hit was. That was a long time ago, and since then, you've had to live your life and be a human being, right?
yeah, no money, pay the mortgage.
Well,
Yeah,
I mean, I'm sure you and I have both known people who were very famous at one point, and then next thing they were kind of destitute. And so it doesn't mean anything. Very few people become multi-billionaires. Even Michael Jackson, because of the lifestyle that he lived,
mm.
he had to constantly find the money to maintain all that he had amassed.
Yeah,
And I, Elvis, I was recently watching that Elvis movie, the
oh
newer
yeah,
Elvis movie, and I've been a couple of times to Graceland, and so you get the impression that it was all uncharted territory, and so he didn't really have anything to follow. There wasn't really anybody to advise him and say, okay, when you make all this money, you should invest in this and invest in that, because nobody had ever done it before.
mm.
You probably heard they say that the Beatles made less money from merch than Bon Jovi did, because when the Beatles did it, they didn't know they were able to own that.
Probably
And so,
wasn't really a thing then, was it? As it is
well,
now.
anybody who wanted to could make Beatles
Yeah,
wigs and make all
yeah,
the profits and give nothing to the Beatles.
yeah,
It's like when
mm.
sampling came along, isn't it? People didn't realize that you actually had to pay the people that you had sampled from,
Yeah,
and so it took a few lawsuits before that got established. And these days, where we can make multimedia, I'm big into making videos. I love the visual side of music as well, not just the
mm.
music. And so you've got to search a little carefully to find all the materials that you want, that you're not infringing somebody's copyright or having to pay an arm and a leg to use something like the
Yeah,
BBC, like the BBC does. The amount of
yeah.
money they pay to use a clip is ridiculous.
Mm. So these days there are some incredible computer programs which are not that difficult to use, to create some amazing graphics, original graphics, of course, without having to go out filming. So
Yeah,
you can
I'm
actually,
working on an animated video right now, and that's something that's quite new and very amusing.
hmm,
Uh, so I mean, even all of the technology, to be honest, I'm talking to you on the same MacBook I used to create the album that we've been talking about.
yeah,
And so it always strikes me as funny that all the best studios in the world, Abbey Road and Air and everywhere, we couldn't do stuff as good as it sounds now on this little computer.
yeah, and it's fantastic what you
Yeah,
can do
but
these days.
all the money they spent and all the expertise back then, and now we've got it at our fingertips. I'm really happy that I've lived long enough to be able to experience that and use it.
Yeah, can you imagine what it would have been like if we had this technology then?
Well, yeah,
How things would have turned out.
well, there was a movie, I can't remember what it's called now. It must be a British movie where a Indian guy somehow happens upon Beatles songs, and the Beatles never existed or something like that.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah, yeah. Yes,
Ed Sheeran is in the movie. So this guy suddenly starts putting out Beatles songs, and
yes.
he is amazed by it. So indeed,
God.
if we could get into the TARDIS and go back,
Yeah,
so with everything we know now and the technology and the songs that we can write now that we couldn't have written back then, we would have all been huge superstars, wouldn't we? Compared to what was around. Or
that's a good. Yeah, that's actually. Let me ask you, what would you do if you could do that? Would you change anything for yourself, for your life, for your musical career?
oh yes, yeah, absolutely, I would. change almost everything. If I could have the album that we have now, Battle Cry, this album in 2023, if I could have had that in 1981, I think that would have been incredible, wouldn't it? You know, in every way. I mean, one of the things, to be honest, is and our diehard Classix fans might not like this, but all the growling and screaming that I was doing in the early days. I mean, I did that probably for the first 2 or 3 years. So I know a lot of people, if they remember me or remember Classix, that's what they're thinking of. And the reason for it really was I wasn't really a soul singer, you know. I just didn't have any soul. I didn't have any gravel in the tone of my voice. And so I sort of manufactured some other extrovert thing. I mean, partly I liked artists like Sparks, I like Lena Lovitch, you know, Arthur Brown, Fire, and so all these sort of more left field type singers appeal to me. So I like that idea of doing something that just a bit different rather than crooning love songs. But now I've got older, that I realize, okay, well, that's for a moment. You can sort of do the novelty thing, but in the end, singing is about delivering a song. It's about melody. It's about feeling. And so on this new album, all I really wanted to do was deliver the songs. I didn't want to do any acrobatics. I didn't want to do anything to particularly draw attention to my performance. My performance was subservient to the songs and to the whole. And so if I'd have been able to do that back in the day, I think it would have been a lot better.
Yeah, you've done a great job for this album. Your voice is really good. And it's very, 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 very tasteful, must say.
Well, hopefully all the people that were put off by the growling and screaming back in the day will give us another listen and realize that's not all there ever was.
Well, hopefully you'll probably be doing some of those tracks anyway if you go on tour, I guess.
Well, I like your optimism.
Maybe a few keys lower.
Well, the thing is that now that we've set a bar with the production of this album, when people ask me about going out live, I say, well, our live performance would have to be as good as the album is, and that would cost a lot of money.
I can hear it live, you know. I really can. It could be an epic show.
Well, certainly, it's got all this space there, and
yeah, absolutely.
We can certainly imagine how it would be, but it's got to be, you know, first class sound. It's got to be first class light show and all that.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You know, with a crew, and so that's going to take a lot of money. So I don't know if that's going to happen. I can see why a lot of artists now of our era are going out doing the unplugged thing, the acoustic shows. Because it's cheap, you know. Gary Newman just goes out with 2 acoustic guitars instead of all the other stuff, paraphernalia. He's making a lot of money. But for us, you see, we didn't have to do this album. We haven't built our lives around trying to continue to be the band that we used to be. And even though we've all done music in some shape or form over the years, we didn't try to keep the thing going. We didn't depend on it. And so as a result, we don't have to do anything. We've got happy lives that exist already. And if anything, we don't really want those to be interrupted. But if they are, they have to be for the right reason. Like, for instance, the last time I think I went out and did a sort of major concert on my own, I went to Poland at a big venue. Polish people will know it. It's called Sopot. So Shirley Bassey has played there. Elton John has played there. It's a big glass stage in a forest. And it's absolutely beautiful. And so they flew me out first class, and we had video screens and everything. It was just the greatest experience. But having done that, I said to myself, I'm not going back unless they do this for me again. So I'm not flying coach anymore, and if I don't have the best sound and the best technicians, I don't really want to do it. So that's the problem with getting older, isn't it? At the start, you'll pretty much do everything, right? You know, anything you're out to do, anywhere you're invited, you'll go and do it. But at this point of life, we're only going to do it if it's going to be right. And so whether it ever will be, I really don't know.
Well, I mean, I think everything's pointing in the right direction. You got a first class album there, and it could only just get better. So,
Well, it just needs people to buy it now.
I'm sure they will.
I think a lot of times the fans don't realize that because they think they can just go and listen on Spotify or something, and we're not going to make a penny out of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Apple, we actually posted something recently, a video showing what artists do make from the various different.
Yeah.
The fact that there are vinyl records again now, that's pretty amazing. And so from a vinyl record, we make a few pounds, whereas when you go all the way down from the vinyl to the CD and then to the online place, I think Amazon is one of the worst, where the artists hardly get anything. And so Bandcamp is good. We didn't really know about Bandcamp, and then somebody started asking if we could do a listening party. So tomorrow we have a listening party on Bandcamp, and when you order Bandcamp, the band gets a much bigger chunk than they get from anywhere else. You probably know this, but the viewers might not know this. I didn't know it. And they also do a thing which is really amazing, where on the first Friday of every month, if you order on Bandcamp, the band gets even more. The band gets something like 80% of the whole thing.
Right.
So that's impressive. So folks, if you're watching, First Friday on Bandcamp is a good place if you want the digital version of our album. But if you want the vinyl version, then on Friday, November 17th, you can buy it from Cherry Red or all other good retailers. If you buy the vinyl record, then we actually do make a little bit out of that, so we can put it towards a fund to go out there and actually perform live.
That's it. So you can buy a few defibrillators and stuff like that just to get on the side of the stage.
Well, thank God I've remained pretty healthy all my life. I've never really had anything thus far. They say touch wood, don't they?
Yeah. Yeah.
I've never had a operation of any kind, and I've not really ever been seriously sick. So I'm thankful.
Excellent. I've got to ask you about the keyboards on this album, because obviously being a keyboard player, I'm been analyzing every little sound and trying to figure out what you're using, because I've got so many plugins on my computer. I guess you've got the same or something similar. So I'm just very curious to know what you were using to create some of those sounds.
Well, actually, the whole album is done on Logic. I like Logic better than Pro Tools.
That's what I use as well, Logic. Yeah.
Yeah. And so mostly I'm using the inbuilt stuff.
Right.
Obviously, they have good libraries of loops, but it depends. Now, some people, when we say loops, they don't like the sound of it, and I think they're thinking of something else. They're thinking of DJs.
DJs, exactly. Just pressing the button.
Get some stupid thing around and around. But what I'm really thinking is when I'm making orchestras and that kind of stuff, that to have to manipulate them. Sometimes I'll be going online and searching because I just cannot find what I want. So I found a number of sites where you can get things. I mean, I'm trying to think what different ones on the album now that you might recognize, but I forget because I finished the album a few months back. But definitely with the orchestras, that to me is the most challenging thing, because I know the parts that I want to create, but I want them to sound authentic.
Yeah.
And obviously the best way, if you can't actually hire the string players, the best way is you actually have a recording of somebody really playing violins and stuff. And so I'll be doing a lot of cutting and pasting and pitch shifting. And so that's how I'm putting that stuff together. For the most part, with keyboards, see, I would kind of feel on this album we don't have so many kind of dominant type. There's a couple of songs that have maybe a lead line on a keyboard, and so depending what it is, sometimes it will be trying to kind of recreate more of the 80s type of thing, like with Inside Outside. I wanted that really kind of 80s lead sort of sound just for that. In Color Me the Sky, there's like a keyboard solo before we get into all the guitar solos and that. And personally, I'm very much a textures kind of person, and so obviously you've gathered that from the whole production, and so there's the huge moments. There's lots of stuff that I would not have appreciated back in the day, but where you place stuff in the mix. So usually things like orchestras are placed quite far back, and so getting the right reverb. Sometimes in voices, you referred earlier to Wretched and the sort of vibe in that song, and so just placing the monks and the different voices into their space far away, so it kind of sounds a bit like they're in a cathedral or a monastery or whatever. I've really got into, and that's another reason actually why I love Logic, because their effects are fantastic, aren't they?
They are superb.
Especially their reverbs and stuff. I mean, I probably spent a large part of my life in recent years just trying all those different ones, like the ones that say up in a balcony and Botter Church and all
Batcave. I mean, it's perfect for especially for doing films. If you're doing film soundtracks, you can use it, inside a car.
But I'm still learning, even though I've been recording for so many years. There's a kid from Texas who sort of came on my radar recently who produces himself on Logic. He says he's 21 now, and he says he learned Logic when he was 10 years old. So he's got some new stuff out, and I was listening to my headphones and hearing that he had stuff like, nice delayed reverb. So his voice sounds kind of close, but then you're hearing the nice shh, in the background that's coming from his voice. And I like that. I think I want to do something like that. And so with the effects, with the keyboards, I mean, I'm kind of lazy. So if I can do it, first of all, within Logic, I will. But if I cannot find what's there, then I'm going to go and search further and wider. The only thing really that I tend to use a fair bit that I imported as a plugin was a dynamic equalizer.
Right.
Like before I started this album, I didn't really know about that. I was probably using some, but I didn't realize what was actually happening. And so for those who don't know, with the dynamic equalizer, you choose a particular frequency, and then the machine will just pull it down when that frequency gets too much. And so that's very useful with things like drums, certain drum sounds. I absolutely love drums. It's really my favorite instrument. I've always loved drums and rhythms, even though I've never played them. And so sometimes with a snare drum, you can get like a nasty little edge to it or something, a frequency that you don't really like that you want to pull out. With any sounds really, like you say, with keyboard sounds, sometimes I'll be hearing things like a particular synth sound often might have a low frequency thing that you don't really need, like there's a there that you might not even hear on your speakers normally, but it's unpleasant. And so you've got to remove that particular to get the thing. With, again, loops, I mean, we can call them audio files is probably a better term than just because we're not necessarily looping them. But with audio files, a lot of times there might be a particular synthy thing, like in the beginning of Inside Outside on this album, where I found a thing that I sort of liked the sound of it, but it wasn't what I imagined. Again, in my head, I've got particular textures. To me, they're like paintings, actually. And so there might be a color in there. I don't like that particular color. So I'm going to take out that color and I'm going to put in something else. Sometimes I might put like a soft distortion, even on vocals. Sometimes I use a very soft distortion. And one of the reasons they have those kind of plugins is because back in the day, we were all using the tube microphones, the good old Neumanns that Abbey Road and all the studios have always had. And so as things have got more digitized, they've tended to get a bit colder and a bit more brittle sounding. So sometimes actually putting in just a tiny little bit of warm distortion on a voice can be really helpful. I find not just a voice, but anything. It could be a keyboard. I think we've got a little tad of vocoder stuff in there in a couple of pieces. And as I mentioned to you, I had a vocoder back in the day, so I know what it's supposed to sound like.
Yeah,
So,
there are some great ones around actually. Some really good ones.
well, of course, they've got much better over the years, because the one that we used to have was a Roland with a keyboard.
Right, with a little microphone
And
sticking out the top.
yeah,
That one.
and it could do string sounds. It could do so-called choir sounds. I used to use all that kind of stuff. But to me, the
Yeah,
actual vocoder sound was really interesting, because I used to stick all kind of things in there. I used to stick in drum boxes and rhythms and so on. So you get this, funny
yeah,
wacka wacka thing
yeah.
at the beginning of Is It a Dream? The rhythm thing, electronic rhythm thing, is actually a rhythm box going into a vocoder.
Right.
So I've always liked exploring, experimenting stuff there. But sometimes to give a keyboard a little feature, it just needs the right moment. As
Mm.
as I mentioned in Color Me the Sky, we have a keyboard solo before we have a guitar stuff. So Gary was wanting to put his guitar solo in there, and the rest of us were saying, well, no, it's kind of nice to have a keyboard solo for a change
Mm.
in there, a little melodic thing. It reminded me a tiny bit in sort of mood of some of the things Ultravox would have done back in the day,
Yeah,
because I love Billy Curry. I think
yeah.
he was really a genius, and I think never got enough credit, because obviously he was in the Gary Newman stuff and he was in the Visage and all that.
Mm.
So he had a big influence over what 80s music ended up sounding like. But I'm not sure that everybody really knows that.
Oh, he was, yeah, it was. Do you know Warren Can from Ultravox?
Yeah. We did a few gigs with Ultravox in those early days, and
Mm.
yeah, he's great.
Yeah.
Did you work with him or something?
Sorry?
Did you work with him?
No, we became good friends. I tried to call him just the other day. He's over in California, in LA. But last time I saw him was he stayed over here when he got his flight back from. We went to Ireland when they were touring a few years ago, and he stayed over here so he could get his flight back to LA. That was the last time I saw him. But I met him at the time when I was with the Seagulls, and with Russell, of course. So we used to hang out at Billy's house and Warren's house and Finchley, and yeah, again, those were crazy times. We used to go out to the clubs and so forth. So,
Yeah, well, BP said he was always friendly with Billy. I'm not too sure where they were friends from, but last time I saw Midge, we were actually at an airport and we were both in the passport line. So he was coming back from
yeah,
playing somewhere, I was coming back from playing somewhere, and that's kind of life, isn't it?
yeah,
It's the life of a touring musician.
yeah.
Uh,
Well, we always used to hang out in Stringfellows because they used to play there.
yes.
That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, back in those days.
Well, you reminded me actually. There was one time I was on BBC. It was probably Radio One, I suppose. Maybe I think it was a Saturday, and whatever the show was, Steve Strange was on as well.
Right.
So we're sitting around there. I think it might have been the Alan Freeman show, if he still had one at that time. And anyway, so when we've done our thing, Steve says, "Do you want to go to Stringfellows?" So I says, "All right." So we go over there, and of course they had the sort of the celebrity goldfish bowl, didn't they? And do you remember that? They had a special, like a sort of couch. So I guess it was all lit up, so they bring champagne. They wanted celebrities to be seen,
Oh, upstairs in the restaurant. Was that?
Maybe I don't remember exactly,
Mm.
but so while we're sitting there, Phil Lynott comes along and he says, "Oh, hi, how you all doing?" kind of thing, and then wanders off. And Lemmy came along and said, "Hello," in his northern accent.
Mm.
And so it's kind of so funny that whole celebrity thing, isn't it? Sometimes I would get asked to go and judge competitions. There was a venue, it was a big venue in London. I can't remember what it was called now. And
Wasn't the
so
Hippodrome, was it?
I don't know. It was anyway. It was for lookalikes, so they had Madonna lookalikes, and I can't remember who the boys were supposed to look like. Maybe it was Michael Jackson. I don't know.
Mm.
But one of the guys there was um, I've forgotten his name right now, but he was a journalist who'd founded kind of obscure record company as well, and I see his name around. It was a bit like the English version of Chess Records. You know, his name would come back to me later on. But it is so weird, isn't it? On that whole scene, that whole circuit, you have to, especially for me being the singer, usually the front man, they want to go to all the right parties and that sort of thing. If you've got a record out, and so whoever had records at the time, were Depeche Mode or Culture Club or whatever, you all have to be seen in those places. And I always hated that. I like people. I've always liked talking to people, even back then. But just the whole idea of just posing just to be seen, that never really appealed to me very much.
Yeah, it was very much a poser's paradise at the time. But
Yeah.
it was a good place to network. And I was performing there once or twice a week, I think it was. So I got to meet a lot of people from the inside. So
for you, playing keyboards is important because everybody always needs a keyboard player. Like I said, we didn't have a keyboard player in the band for the first few years, and then eventually, when we changed the lineup a little, then we got somebody, and then it changes everything really.
Yeah.
I did one tour of Poland. I think the final Classix Nouveaux tour in Poland, we had quite a big lineup actually. Where we had the keyboards, we had the percussionist, we had 2 female backing singers. There was quite a few of us on stage. You know, I guess things started going in that direction by that point.
What was the last time you actually played together back in the day? Do you remember which year that was? Your last concert?
Well, I mean, the real Classix Nouveaux lineup, as we would see it, obviously Gary moved on before we got to our third album, when he was replaced by the guy from Finland. We kept going that was through 83, I guess. And then EMI dumped us after the third album. And so everybody was pretty much gone then. Right. But we still had tours booked. So our manager asked me, well, do you want to do the tours? So I said, okay. And so we just had to get in some other people. So obviously with Gary, so that's in a sense the classic lineup that people know. Classic, that would have been 82. With Jimmy after him, we would have finished in sometime probably 83, I guess. And then Classix as a whole, then when I had different lineups for the last tours, that would have gone on till 85, really. Because in 85, I had a hit with San Damiano, and then all of a sudden, I was the new thing on my own, and I had a new record deal for me. And so Classix kind of fizzled out at that point. The thing is that you obviously have enjoyed the album, and you had the opportunity to listen to it because we were going to have this chat, or when you were going to have a chat with Gary. But the problem for the general public, and I'm sure you know this over the years, all of the different artists you've worked with and the different projects you've had, that it's not necessarily your best work that gets the most acclaim or that becomes the most famous. And in many instances, it's the opposite.
Yeah.
You know, so just because it's a great album doesn't mean it's going to be widely known and widely recognized. So that's why I take a little bit of a wait and see view when we're talking about touring and things like that, because I don't know if it's going to come to that, because I don't know if it's going to generate enough income to justify that, or even enough of an audience, to be honest. I mean, we know obviously the diehard fans will buy it, but that's not enough to make it successful. So to be successful these days requires something more. I know a lot of artists of our generation, they're really making their money from touring now. And if you don't have another kind of job, then I'm sure that's great. And that's what you should and what you have to do. But I'm quite happy to stay at home in Florida and enjoy the sunshine. So I don't need to go to cold, grey, snowy places. Even when I lived in London for many years, my house was in Kilburn. And so whenever I'd get home from somewhere else, another country, Kilburn, it would just look so grey. It is, it's so kind of grey and a bit depressing, really. So
Concrete jungle.
yeah, I can understand when people, want to buy houses in other countries.
I'm looking forward to the next album, not just this one, but
Oh my goodness, I think I'll be dead before that.
I don't know. I don't know about that. I think it's going to get better and better. I've got
I,
a feeling.
I said to the other guys, I don't ever want to go through that again.
Really?
Or if we do, then I think we need to get another producer next time because it's so. I mean, the first sort of 18 months or so are fine because it's just kind of, casually exploring stuff when you feel like it. But when you're in the final stretch and it comes down to all the pressure of getting it finished and the mixes and all that. I know some producers who don't even mix their own stuff. They just say, all right, I'm going to send it to somebody else. It's just too stressful and too challenging. And there's even other things that I didn't know about. Originally, we were just going to put the album out online and there you are, fans. That's it. Forget about it. And then immediately they started talking about wanting CDs. And then they started talking about wanting vinyl. And so I'm saying to the guys, well, look, if they want vinyl records, we're just going to have to do a deal with the record company. We can't cope with all this on our own.
Yeah.
And so once we've done a deal with the record company, and then you get into this big company operation where I'm dealing with people, I've never even met them. I don't know what their names are, who's responsible for this, who's responsible for that, the whole production line thing, who they're using for printers. The CDs are getting made in Poland, the records are getting pressed in Germany. And when it came to the mastering process, I discovered that initially my mixes were too bright and too wide. And so what I was told by a mastering engineer was when it comes to cutting vinyl, again, it's something I would never have known anything about back in the day when all we had was vinyl records. But apparently, if your stuff is too bright or it's too stereo, the needle cuts deeper in the groove. So the deeper that the needle cuts, the more noise you get and the quieter it gets. So basically, we had to remix everything. And so I had to go back, and where there were effects that were making things stereo, I had to take them out. Where if there were things that were brightening up things too much, because I recall when digital stuff first came along, I don't know if you recall, I think it was a Yamaha desk was the first one I came across that was a digital desk in the studio. And when I heard how clear and bright things could be, I was really excited. I was like, wow, I love this. I know a lot of purists, they love tape and they believe it's warmer and all this. I'm much more into the technology, really. I love the fact that you could be so bright, so crisp, those high frequencies on strings or little triangle things that you would never really have quite heard before.
Especially now with the really high quality recordings. I mean, it's even more so now.
And also with stereo, obviously there's been over the years there's been quadraphonic, and there's, I forget what they call it now, you have on Logic where you can do surround sound for movie track.
5.1.
Yeah. So I like all that kind of stuff. And so I tend to want to pan things very wide if I can.
I think you've been using one of those plugins which sends it wide.
Well, but I had to take them all out.
Yeah,
that was the thing.
It's very easy to over egg it with those plugins.
Well, the thing is with guitars. See, one of the little techniques that I tend to use oftentimes is if I've got a single guitar, then I'll do just a very tiny delay, so that then you've got it on the other side as well. I've been doing that for years. I love that kind of thing. Especially like with an acoustic guitar, instead of just having one stuck in the middle or slightly off to the side somewhere, I like to stereoify it so it's coming at you close from both speakers. But I was kind of forced to revisit and sacrifice some of those kinds of things. You're still okay with guitars, but with some of the things, with drums in particular, there's phasing stuff that can go on. I mean, I've just done a 12-inch remix of Battle Cry, the song, to come out in the, it's 8 minutes long and very drum orientated. And the mastering engineer just told me, you're going to have to check the phasing on the drums there. For people that are going to get bored with our tech talk who are watching, phasing means when the other side is slightly out with one side. And so if you listen on a single speaker on your phone or whatever it is, then the thing, if at worst, it can disappear. Sometimes it can just get kind of quiet or lose its impact. So I've got to go back. I sometimes forget to check things in mono because I enjoy the whole studio sound experience so much, you know.
Were you sort of as hands-on back in the 80s as you are now with recordings? Or
Well,
did you rely more?
Well, to some degree I was. I just didn't know as much. So what tends to happen when you get a hit is all of a sudden they want you producing all these up and comings who are hoping to get a hit.
Yeah.
So EMI gave me a couple of artists who, artists might be generous, but anyway, people that they had signed who they wanted me to try and do some magic with. So I used to actually bring Stuart, the keyboard player of Kajagoogoo, was around the time. So I used to bring him into the studio. He was very much into the sort of Prophet 5 type of sound, which was current. And so I could direct an engineer to what I thought I wanted with the production. But I was probably more arrangement side than the real technical side. I didn't know how to get the good echoes and things. Earlier on, you referred to the whole Atari, and when Cubase started, that was when I started learning. So that was probably early 90s, I should think.
Yeah.
But the other thing that happened for our final Classix Nouveaux album back in the day, we had this producer, Alex Sadkin, who'd been the house engineer for Island Records in the Bahamas. So he had worked with everybody famous. And because he was an engineer originally, he was just totally attuned to the sounds. So he could listen to something and say, well, it's missing 5,000 hertz or something. Now, these days, it's fairly common because on our computers, you can read all that stuff. But back then, when it was all on tape, it was very unusual for any producer to know that stuff, because I'd worked with people like Tony Visconti, you know, and Colin Thurston, who did the early Duran hits, and he was an engineer as well first. But Sadkin, he really knew his stuff. And so, for instance, when we recorded the drum tracks for our third album, he was saying, I think it's missing something up in the 10K. And he would listen to the input and then the output. And, you know, he was A, B, A, B. I think it's missing. And he made the tape op go and line up all the heads again. So that's how fussy he was. But when it came round to time for mixing, he said, tomorrow, I want you to bring in all your favorite records and we're going to listen. So I was a bit of a snob at the time. I was like, we don't want to copy anybody else, you know, we don't care what they're doing. But what, again, it's become standard really in recording these days. We now call them reference tracks. But back then, I'd never heard of it and never seen anybody do it. So the next day, we're listening. I can remember one of the albums I had was ABC, you know, The Whole Look of Love or whatever it was. Obviously, Trevor Horn's first big major production. And so Alex would listen to whatever we were mixing. And, oh, yeah, okay, I think the drums are not quite punchy enough there, or something needs to be a bit brighter, that kind of thing. So I learned a lot from him, really, paying attention to the frequencies and the whole idea of reference tracks and all of that. But I think what really made the difference is Logic. Obviously, I'd started using Cubase way earlier, and then I started using GarageBand as well at a certain point. And GarageBand is good, by the way, for people. You know, some people would put it down because it's the amateur thing, but they've kept improving.
But now it's got even better. Well, I don't use it, but it is really good.
They've kept improving it, and so I really recommend for young musicians aspiring to something. You know, don't be a snob. If you can do something, if you don't know anything, do something on GarageBand, and you're going to start learning. But the other thing, there are other things with Logic I really like. For instance, with the drum kits, you know, that you can now make drum kits that sound way better than you could ever do with just microphones.
Mm.
I've worked with a couple of producers who could do good drums, but then what was considered good drums, like when David Bowie, Let's Dance came out, I remember all the guys in my band were, wow, Let's Dance. You know, that was sort of thought to be the greatest drum sound there. But clearly we went a long way on from there.
Mm.
When Queen did obviously the Bohemian Rhapsody and all that stuff, and Night at the Opera, I'd heard they spent like 10 days or 2 weeks getting the drum sound.
Mm.
But if you listen now, they sound like matchboxes, don't they? You know?
Yeah.
And at one point, for I think it might have been my first solo album, I worked with a couple of the guys who became the Art of Noise.
Oh, right.
And so Gary, the engineer, he had been working, one of the things he'd worked on at that time was Scritti Politti.
Mm.
And, you know, when they started having those hits, Would Be's and things like that, and Arif Mardin was actually the producer, Gary was the engineer, and they had a fantastic drum sound. And that obviously has to have been Gary, because Arif Mardin was an old-time, you know, producer and stuff, so he would have not necessarily been into the current, you know, big drum sounds.
They had a very modern sound at that time, didn't they?
Right, yeah.
It was very, very fresh sounding.
Yeah. I was always into, you know, I'd always had an ear for, like, you know, Red Box when they came along. I liked the fact that Red Box, I mean, I became friends with Simon, but they had a very fresh sort of approach to things, because it had a sort of world music element to it. But the songwriting was sort of interesting, because it would start off as a slow song, and then all of a sudden it's a fast song, and there'd be elements of it that you just wouldn't expect. So, and again, it was a great production. Those things were produced by David Motion, who again I went on to work with. And I did, first of all, a few remixes, and then after that I did an album with a band I worked with in Italy called Rockets, who was very synthy, keyboard orientated. David Motion produced, and his engineer, again, funnily enough, his engineer was called Trigger, and he could get a great drum sound. He just knew what to do with all the compressors and everything like that. And so I've always logged those things over the years. So I guess I've learned from some of the best. So I'm not as good as they were, but you know, I've got a lot better over the years, let's say.
Well, we both know how many different settings there are in Logic. Don't you find that it can be a bit over sort of too much once you've got a sound that you want to use? It's easy to keep going back and changing it all the time. Do you find that, do you have a moment where you decide to stop messing around with the plugins and just settle for what you've got?